Welcome to Modern Anarchy, the podcast featuring real conversations with conscious objectors to the status quo. I'm your host, Nicole.
I tried to keep her quiet, but she's screaming inside of me. I tried to keep her hiding, oh, shut up. I tried to keep her quiet, but she's a wild, wild woman.
Hello, fellow anarchists out there. On today's episode, we have a conversation with Destinie, all about how asexuality redefines our understanding of human development and what sexuality really means. Together, we talk about the independence of the virgin goddesses, the taboo of intimacy, and being proudly ace. I feel like the biggest thing I'm taking away from this conversation with Destinie is just this profound frustration, I guess is probably the right word, with the fact that some people have such a hard time with acknowledging that there are other perspectives out there, other tastes, other desires that may not be the same as theirs. Somehow that makes us so insecure about what that means for us that we try to say, something's wrong with you for being different. Yeah, I don't know. And I think you're going to hear that throughout this conversation with Destinie and all the people that try to tell him that something was wrong with who they are. And so it is with much honor and joy that I get to hold a space for these conversations and to maybe help someone else out there that is on the ace spectrum to know that nothing is wrong with you. Tune in. Hello, anarchist community. I'm taking a pause here to talk about something new for the podcast and the movement that I'm really excited about. So I talked about starting a Patreon a couple episodes back, and I wanted to make the announcement that I want this Patreon to be also a form of mutual aid. I want this to give back to the community. I want this to be a way of collecting our resources to support the movements that we're talking about in this space. I mean, and even throughout this last year of recording, so many different guests on the podcast to talk about how do we actually bring action to so much of our care. And I think one way I want to be contributing to that with all of you and all of the listeners is by making sure that 50% of all Patreon pledges go directly to a mutual aid fund. And what I'm thinking is I could have a different mutual aid fund each month. If you as guests and as listeners of the podcast have ideas of mutual aid funds, I'm all ears. Please send me an email. I can find a different one for each month. And then, 50% will always be going to support the work and the movement of all the things that we're talking about. So for this month of March, together we will be supporting the Brave Space Alliance, which is the first Black-led, trans-led LGBTQ plus center on the south side of Chicago. And they are dedicated to creating and providing affirming, culturally competent care and services for the LGBTQ plus community on the south and west sides of the city. So, I mean, the work that they're doing there is amazing and absolutely so important, and I am excited, and it is such an honor to be able to support them this month with the pledges from all of you listeners out there. So, if you want to contribute and be active with your resources in supporting this movement, then I'll invite you to check out the Patreon link below. There, at least currently, I have a $2 and a $5 level. Maybe I should be increasing that. Currently, I have a $2 and $5 level, and I think we can do a lot. We can do a lot together to make this world a better place and to, bring about the change that we're always talking about here. So I hope all of y'all enjoy the episode, the normal anchor ad, and tune in. So you're in school?
I'm in school for my doctorate, but I'm also a therapist and a professor. So.
Oh, wow. Okay, where are you getting your doctorate at?
I'm getting my doctorate over at Pacifica Graduate Institute.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Well, it's in depth psychology where we're specialized in integrative therapy and healing.
Cool. Okay, so I only know a little bit. That's Jungian.
Yeah.
Yeah, what's your short-term definition of it? Because I haven't learned anything about depth psychology in my program.
Well, I mean, if we look at the term death, it means like going really into the unconscious. It's staying into the shadow, really leaning into that. It's bringing in the psyche. So it's a lot of how can we expand outside of this like Western psychological narrative
Sure.
of, okay, think this, do this, and kind of being with the client in that shadow underworld. We Jungians use the term underworld, the underworld
Sure.
where the
Sure.
nasty stuff is, and not just say, okay, how can we just immediately get you out of it? It's like, okay, what is being in this space telling us about what's going on?
Yeah, definitely that maybe we don't want to confront.
Mm-hmm.
How did you choose that type of psychology? Because I had never even heard about that.
Yeah, that was, well, I mean, I grew up in a household that was like oracle and tarot cards and talking to like spirit and doing samples. My mom's a yoga teacher slash training to be a yoga therapist. So yeah, I came from a household where that kind of talk was normal. And my first degree is in history. So I was going to be a lawyer.
Okay.
So this is like a thing, like, you know,
Tell me the story.
Yeah, I was going to be a lawyer. I actually got into a master's program for history when I was like, I don't know if that's really for me. And then it's funny, I went to Turkey and I went to like, this will come in because I went to Artemis's temple and Edifice and the Virgin Mary's.
Yeah.
And came back and had basically a breakdown on the college campus of like, I'm not supposed to be here, like was calling my mom, crying, like this isn't for me. And I basically just bounced. I left. I left.
Wow.
So I that's what we would call in the Jungian term of entry into the underworld. Got really depressed, kind of floated for 3 years, was a surgery scheduler somehow at a doctor's office. And then I think there was one point where I was like, you know what, like I need to figure it out. And I went back and went a year at Cal Lutheran University and got my degree in psychology. And then somehow became a therapist. If people know me, I have social anxiety. I'm socially awkward. This is like, this is me. And they're like,
I'm with you.
And I got into the Cal Lutheran program because I'm like, oh, they don't require a thesis.
Yeah, you're like, that's what I want. Less work, please.
And somehow became a therapist, like, and while, you know, training, I've always wanted to be a doctor since I was 5. And I'm like, okay, because for a while there, especially, after I dropped out of my first master's program, the whole idea of me becoming a doctor seemed like far away. And I'm like, oh, it's close. And decided to apply. And I was originally going to go to Texas Women's University, and the universe brought tornadoes. And I'm like, nope. And I'd already said no to Alliant, and Pacifica was there. And I was like, okay, Pacifica. And I think a lot of Pacifica students have this weird kind of journey. And and when I got there, and they're like, active imagination, like you're talking to these figures, and you know, you're all this stuff that I grew up with that I always kind of loved and had. I mean, I studied mythology. I loved mythology, but like, I don't need that in therapy. And then I go to Pacifica, and they're like, nope, here you go. And here I am writing a dissertation where Artemis, when I saw it with Turkey, which kind of led me on this whole entryway, she's really prevalent in the beginning stages of my dissertation writing. So it's just a weird journey of how I got there, that it was twists and roads. And I mean, starting from like a history degree to be a lawyer, and now I'm a trauma therapist and
for sure
studying Jungian, it's like, whoa, how did I get here?
Yeah. This whole journey of figuring out what you actually want to do when you have so many options. I mean, I thought I wanted to be a lawyer as well, which is why I majored in English and minored in philosophy, because I was like, great, I'm going to just do so well in the LSAT. This is going to prep me. So I was in a similar boat where I was just thinking that's what I wanted to do. And then I went medicine. So then I did chem and bio, and then I came back to psychology. So I did this whole thing too. We were just trying to figure it out.
If you look at my undergrad transcripts, like I could could have majored, my minors were in women's studies and ethnic studies because I was doing a lot of social
Love it.
advocacy kind of stuff. And then if you look at my transcript, like I had a graduate class in Arthurian literature, like I almost could have gotten a literature degree. Like I had a bunch of psychology. Yeah. I was like, I don't know. You can see like this confusion, but also the pressure of you need to get this kind of done and just jumping on kind of what I had. But I love learning. So you can like see through my, like people like, I even had a student like, what aren't you trained in? I'm like, I don't know. I love learning.
Yeah.
So
for me, math. I don't know much of it.
It's not math for me. Numbers, I see numbers and my mind blanks out. But
exactly.
You know, like I still read up on history and mythology and literature and stories. Like I'm a huge Lord of the Rings nerd. Like that will always be a part. And I love that it's been really prevalent in the work that I do now.
Well, yeah, and I mean, what is history? What is literature but things created by humans?
Yeah.
It's all psychology at the end of the day, right? It's the history of psychology.
The history of psychology.
Exactly, because it's just humankind and the way we write these stories and narratives that we connect to, especially with things like mythology, which used to guide people's purpose in life and how they saw themselves. I mean, yeah, it's all psychology.
It's all psychology. And if you look at Jungians, they love the myths because they're like, these are these archetypal, collective, universal images that appear to us and work through us and, you know, come to us. So they're just given different names depending on where, you know, what culture.
Yeah. So I feel like I was told you were studying asexuality.
Yes.
Okay, because I'm like, okay, how does mythology relate to asexuality?
Well, one, I am ace, and I never thought I would study asexuality. That was a whole thing. And reading a lot of work, there's been like this kind of call in this Jungian term to bring in like queer studies. And there's been really nothing on asexuality.
I know. Yes.
Yeah, it's starting to get momentum. It is the internet orientation because it's for sure getting momentum through social media, and it always kind of has. And somehow I was like, asexuality, and I'm like, I really love mythology and the goddesses. And I'm like, oh, the virgin goddesses, which is Artemis, which is Athena, which is Hestia. There's so many. And somehow I'm like, but what about this? And reading about these women who weren't connected to an other in mythology. They weren't in these relationships with other, where we have these other goddesses that were kind of known to be connected to somebody else. And if we look at, you know, the virgin of Greek mythology was not purity or abstinence or celibacy. It was Virgo independent. And I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. And I was also kind of grappling with this other one. And then as I kind of leaned into the asexuality, and basically where's my lived experience as an ace woman who has experience in the mental health field from supervisors and colleagues and, you know, from my own therapists and providers, where I was like, I don't feel comfortable in these spaces because they're already going into there's something wrong with you.
Yes.
And even being told by a supervisor while I was getting my hours, like, how can you even be a therapist if you don't know true intimacy? That took me down.
Holy shit.
Yeah, it was hard, and I even questioned, but then as I kind of leaned in, I'm like, you know what? Nope. And started kind of proclaiming and showing it. I kind of kept it hidden. Like, I didn't really talk about it. Wasn't ashamed, but didn't feel, you know, I had a professor ask me when they found out, like, are you going to therapy? And I kind of have can we swear on here? Because I'm going to like...
Yeah, you can swear all you want. Go for it.
Like a fuck it moment, and started like, you know what? I'm going to just start, as I started getting comfortable as my role as a therapist, kind of saying I'm an asexual therapist.
Yeah.
And even before advertising, I started getting ace clients. And as the more I start getting more, and then like those who I had for a couple like years, and then all of a sudden they're questioning, like, I might be ace, or this is similar, and starting to see it more and more, and then reading about stuff that I love and saying, okay, where are the ace? And just like basically going, if I was an ace Jungian student, what would I want to know? And I wanted to kind of, we have books written about like women and archetypal goddesses and the woman experience, but mostly heterosexual white women. And then we had something bringing in like the lesbian experience. And now I'm like, again, this is with another, I want to bring in the ace experience. So it's almost like a continuation. And again, this is, kind of looking at these virgin goddesses, these mythological figures who, we're always kind of looked at like these independent women, but I'm like, what would it look like through maybe an ace lens?
Yes.
And that's how we get like
how we get all the way through here.
Yeah.
And especially like given the juxtaposition of that one clinician telling you basically something's wrong with you to the vision that you're seeing here of ownership and claiming this identity with pride as something unique and special.
Yeah. And there's a lot of just, I think a reclaiming or even dismantling of this idea of what it means to be, like what sexuality even means.
Yeah.
As in,
tell me.
Yeah, because we live in a very sex normative society where a lot of scholars have, Freud himself were like, in order to basically get to this maturity level, like you need to have sex, you need to be sexual. And they created this narrative that to be human is to be sexual and to engage in sex. And as we know, I mean, asexuality, ace people have been showing up forever, just not really, they were the infamous group X on the Kinsey scale, if anyone's familiar with the Kinsey scale.
Yep.
And so for us who are ace, and then, there's ace who some who don't engage in sex. And it's like, well, we are adults, we are mature, but according to these development milestones, we're not. And there is this kind of stereotype of like the naivety of some of these ace people, or the prudishness, or there's again, you must be traumatic. And again, I'm like, okay, so what does asexuality say about human development and what sex and sexuality means? Right? As in, yes, there is this kind of talk, but what does it mean when you're like, you know what? I don't need it. And I can be a fully functional, fully developed adult. But if we're looking at the scholarship of now, that's not so true.
Exactly. And what a difficult thing to sit with, right? When psychology in that field might be telling you that something's wrong with you, and having that internal conflict of, is something wrong with me, or is this really me? And that's such a difficult place to sit in internally, and especially alone. If you don't feel like you can talk to other people about this, the people that you did talk to about this shut you down immediately, right? I mean, where can you go to have these levels of conversation?
Yeah, especially as a teen, where sex becomes big. And that's where, I never had a crush, ever. I pretended to, but still have not had a crush. I can look at someone like, yeah, they're aesthetically pleasing, but there's no crush happening. And then in high school, when everyone kind of wanted to talk about it, and I'm over here like wanting to talk about Harry Potter. So it's like,
right.
You were the teen conversation. And back then, like, that wasn't, I mean, AVEN, the Asexual Visibility Education Network, kind of started around like the 2000s. So I would have been like 9 or 10, and it still wasn't like big. And so, I mean, I was in high school, I graduated in 2009. So, I mean, that's not a big, internet access was back then. YouTube was kind of just starting, right?
Right. Yes.
And then even when I went to my Pride Center at my undergrad, A was for like ally. There wasn't a lot of talk about asexuality.
Asexual,
so I didn't even have a term for my experience until I was in my early 20s. After around like 22, 23, and then pointing and being like, oh yeah, that's who I am. And now working with ace youth, I mean, they're like, oh yeah, I'm ace. And it's like so cool that they can have this, they don't have to feel maybe as alienated as some of us who grew up without even really knowing that term.
Yeah. Is that what you felt like, alienation?
Yeah, I felt even like, I think some of people back there were looking like, oh, she's young or naive, or is something going on. because I just was not interested in talking about it. Didn't mean, I mean, I'm a kink positive
Sure, of
therapist,
course.
right? I'm very comfortable with my clients talking about sex. I know a lot about sex because trying to figure out why I wasn't interested in it made me really educated on like about like sex.
Of course,
And I find that's
yes.
actually kind of common. Like one of my friends is an A-sex educator. We know, like I'm quite comfortable talking about because it's like, right? There's
Yeah,
nothing.
exactly. Right.
Yeah, and I see, I work with that, actually, I work with a lot of sexual trauma survivors, so sex comes into the conversation. And so again, it's, yeah, what does it mean to be this mature person in a world where sex is normal and to be human is to have and be sexual?
Yeah. And that's exactly what I want to hear. I mean, how do you see yourself functioning in that world?
Hmm. And it's been hard. I mean, if you talk to a lot of ACE individuals, they're terrified to go to the doctor. We're terrified to go, especially at like OBGYN or something like that. And we have to,
Pathologize you.
yeah, be again, immediately going into, okay, like what's wrong?
Yes. Something
And
has to be wrong.
something has to be wrong. And the DSM is full of, all these diagnoses of these sexual dysfunction. Not saying that people can't have them because they can regarding, there's a lot of things that could affect libido. But as we know, asexual has nothing to do with the libido. It is an orientation. And so going to doctors, even now in 2022, is scary. Yeah, we don't know what we're going to get.
Right. And they're not even trained on sex in general, right? They get, I think,
Mm-mm.
what some statistic was saying, they get like 3 hours of sex training
Mm-hmm.
for doctors in the medical field. I mean, so yeah. And then to bring up something like asexuality, that is not even something that they've touched on during their education.
Mm-mm.
So unless they've done this outside work, they're just immediately going to make assumptions about what that experience is.
Yeah, and again, like I think ASEX, which is the sex educator. I forget what it stands for. Dr. Hamilton is that you, Jolie,
Yeah.
that you had.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
I hope I said her last name. um,
Hamilton, I think. Yeah.
yeah, they just, I think, was it last week or 2 weeks ago, this month, just kind of came out and saying like asexuality is a sexual orientation. Like we are honoring that as sex
Yes.
educators, as sex therapists. Like this is now part of the dialogue. And that was like huge,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
huge. But again, it's like
Yep.
2022, right? And we see these with like the queer studies of who's left out of queer studies in general, which are Black people of color.
Mm-hmm.
Pansexuality is starting to get their momentum.
Disabled. Yeah.
Asexuality, polyamorous relationships, knowing
Yep.
the difference between a romantic orientation and a sexual orientation. So we have aromantic. So bringing in these other orientations into the conversation.
Yeah. And what did it feel like finding that label? I know you're talking about later in your life getting to learn about asexuality.
Mhm.
And what did it feel like to learn about this label, knowing since your early childhood you were having these thoughts and wondering and questioning?
That there wasn't anything wrong with me.
Oh, yes.
Because through my research, I was really going into what must be wrong with me. And then
Uh,
I can't even remember what I Googled to figure. I think it was like people who aren't really interested in sex or isn't sexually attracted. And then like this Avon came up, and then I read that, and I'm like, is this real? 'Cause, like, the
yeah.
internet. And then finding the Facebook groups were the first pieces, and then now there's like hashtag asexuality on Instagram, and it's really building momentum through TikTok, and it's been really, Ace by Angela Chen came out. That was
I've read
big.
that book. It's
Yeah,
huge.
it's huge. I remember when that came out and people were like, what? And then, yeah, I mean, we had the Invisible Orientation book, which is great. It's something I recommend. But then we get Ace, and then it really becomes part of the conversation. Yeah.
Yes.
And
Yes.
again, huge. And even when I was thinking of doing this dissertation, starting the research, Ace hadn't come out yet. So it still was a really talked about And there were still people like, what? And now actually presenting, like getting a concept paper, and people even say, wow. And we were actually in a class after I presented concept paper, we were talking about Marilyn Monroe, interesting enough, and her experience. And I'm not saying anything for anyone, but I was thinking like, wow, her experience sounds very familiar to an ACE experience regarding her.
I don't know. Tell me. Yeah.
She would say like she didn't really have orgasms. She thought something was broken within her, and there's a lot of trauma and stuff there. But I'm like, it sounds similar. And I had someone text me because we're online now, and was like, this sounds like an ACE experience. I'm like, after your presentation, now I'm like thinking about that. I'm like, I did my job, like right there, like that. We're not saying anything regarding like Marilyn Monroe. I know she's a big figure, and this can be like a whole thing, but that at least the idea of bringing asexuality into the narrative, to actually sit and think like, could this be an ACE experience, instead of completely writing it off.
Exactly. Carved out this space for that to be a potential identity for someone to take that would allow them to feel authentically themselves, rather than exactly what you're talking about of feeling like, is something wrong with me?
Yeah. And that's what, I want with like psychologists and mental health professionals, is to just have that when someone comes in and they're struggling with sex and not feeling like something's broken because they're just not attracted. And again, we know it's fluidity and people can change, but instead of completely going into, and I say this, everyone asks me like, what it is a medical thing? Well, I ask all my clients to go to the doctor because we know biology affects mental health. So if we're getting that cleared, and why can't we put that on the table as an option of what they're going through versus completely writing it off and then having them go back? Because what can happen is they're asked to go to all these medical exams over and over, and nothing changes because that has nothing to do with biology at that point. And that can be very traumatic in and of itself. So I keep invisible orientation and ACE and these articles on standby. So when we do all that, I'm like, and here's another option. And some people come back and say, not really. And some say, that's me. And it's for the that's me people who, again, have, especially older generations who haven't heard of it, who've been dealing with decades of what's wrong with me.
Exactly. And that is such a hard place to be, because it's questioning what's wrong with my own body and my own natural wants and desires. I mean, that is such a difficult place to be wrestling with.
It's it's been since I was puberty hit, where I'm like, there must be something wrong with me because I'm not with where my peers are at. And finding again that term and realizing I'm like, oh no, there is nothing wrong with me. I'm asexual because I've had everything checked. I'm fine. There's nothing wrong there. And because of that, I was like, yeah. And then I kind of now I'm just more at this point where I'm at, which took a long time. I just proclaim it.
I love that energy. Yes.
Yeah. So when people come like, do you need to go to therapy? Did you go to the doctor? Did you check out? I'm like, I'm ace. Go away.
Yes.
Like, I don't, and again, I'm like, I go to a therapist because of course we go to therapists or psychologists for our own mental health, as that it's a requirement to graduate. But
that's good that
I am a mental health. So again, don't question me. Like, I know what's going on. I'm proudly ace. And since I've declared and kind of owned that and this dissertation topic, I have met wonderful ACE women and ACE professionals. And, we came together, did a panel. Like, it's been amazing. Found out one of them lived like a couple miles away from me. And I was like, oh. So finding the community and then being asked to like speak on this to mental health who are starting their journey, mental health therapist journey as trainees, and being asked to go to these places to talk about what it's like to work with ACE clients.
Yeah, right. And all of this comes from you taking pride in who you are and showing up as your authentic self, right? Because then you're able to speak freely and with the confidence of your own lived experience. So yeah, then you're connecting with all these other people that are learning from you and you're getting to share from.
Yeah. And again, it's recognizing boundaries as well, because one of the questions we ace get is like, well, what's your sex history? And I'm like, I'm not going to tell you my sex history. That's not okay, right? And it's so funny how those in the LGBTQ plus community constantly get asked about our sex history. Like,
Mm-hmm.
no, you don't have the right to our sex history because of our identity. But I also recognize, because of where I'm at, like I feel comfortable talking about certain subjects. So I'm like, come to me with questions. If others who identify as ace, like they don't owe you this education, but I'm choosing to share it, so come to me. And that's kind of what I mean, like I said, I'm a learner. I do teach. I'm adjunct faculty. Like I enjoy teaching. I enjoy doing presentations. So I'm like, talk to me about it. I'm totally open, and I will say no to things that are not okay to ask. So
Right,
yeah.
right. Yeah, what pieces of your story do you feel like are pertinent to like understanding yourself and identity that
Mhm.
you would want other people to know that maybe don't know a lot about asexuality?
Really, it's the one is that, because there's like a miscommunication, because those who are, we call allosexual, so who engage in sex and experience sexual attraction, and then asexual, like there's a miscommunication, because it's like, well, we don't know what it's really like to feel sexually attracted to someone, and they don't understand how we don't. So we do it like sometimes like, well, it's like maybe we look at a really nice painting, and it maybe it's like, oh wow, it's pretty, but that's like it. There's no like want to have sex with that person, right? And of course, there's, gray sexual and demisexual who fall in the in-betweens, and like there needs to be that emotional intimacy. And that's part of the thing I say is I never had a crush. Like that blows people's mind. They're like, how have you never had a crush? I never had a crush on someone. Well, back when you're a kid, it usually when it starts the heterosexual, and I never had a crush on a boy.
Sure.
Ever.
Yeah.
There was
Yeah.
no time where I'm like, oh, he's cute and I never had butterflies in my stomach, like all those things people talk about. Then people started asking in high school, because I wasn't really dating. I was just doing my own thing, wasn't interested in dating. No one, didn't really care about it. So people automatically assumed I was a lesbian, which is like common. And I'm like, well, I'm not dating a girl either. I'm not dating
Yeah.
anyone. And
Right.
they would approach like, you can tell us anything. I'm like, I'm not a lesbian, because I've had girls have crush on me, and I've had guys like, I don't even know when people flirt. My younger brother, who's 5 years younger, would have to be like, hey sis, you know that person? He was like 10. You know that person's flirting with you, right? And I'm like, oh, like and that's a common thing too, is the flirting thing, like those butterflies, and then growing older, it's like, it's just not a priority at all. Because I also am aromantic as well. So I'm like, no, I have so many other things. I want to do so many other stuff, that this being in a relationship, romantic or sexual, is just not a priority to me. And I think that's kind of how it is for so many people. It's like, and we see these articles from like Psychology A Day about like the single epidemic, right? Being single, and like
The
how young
problem.
people aren't engaging in sex, and how this is detrimental. And it's like, well, there's a lot of things going on there, but it could also be that what's happening too is that since asexuality is getting more noted, like it's getting more aware,
Normalized.
like people
Yeah.
are identifying with it more. And of course it's fluid. Things change, you can change, but for me, it's not a priority. I'm like, I got my dissertation, I have my clients, I teach, like there's so many other things I'd rather be doing. And that's why we have the whole, like, the ace cake, like we'd rather eat cake. If you had to choose between sex or cake, we go for the cake. And that's, you may have seen like the images of like the ace and the cake and stuff, because that's like the joke about that.
Right. And once
So
you have that pressure off, you don't have to force yourself to do it.
yeah.
Yeah.
And once I had like that pressure of, you know what, probably not going to happen. I'm like not going to get married. Don't really want kids. I'm going to be an awesome aunt. I felt a lot more freer. And then when my mom actually was like, I'm fully okay with just having grandpuppies. Like I don't
Mm.
need that. So because people ask her like, oh, it's just she hasn't met the right person yet, and she'll be like,
Oof.
I don't think that's going to happen. I'm happy with the dissertation and the PhD and the grand puppies. So that having my mom, like, cause, you know, people get pressure from parents or family members and then my brother coming up being like, are you ace? I'm like, yeah. He's like, I figured. And then I walked away.
Yeah,
Like,
fine, great.
Like those were big. I'm like, oh, okay, cool. Now I can just be me. And, you know, I do get word from like maybe other family members, but the main important ones are fine with it. And I'm like, I'm totally fine with my puppy and living my life. And I don't need, and that's part of where I'm going with that dissertation, that studying of I'm right now on the woman identified experience, because there's a lot of pressure for women to be a mom and get married. So I'm looking at that way. It's that I'm fully okay and comfortable in this space to be perpetually single and be an aunt and
Beautiful.
because my brother loves kids, so that probably will happen. And and I said, you know, eventually, maybe when I'm older, maybe I'll foster, but that's not a huge thing. That's like a maybe. And I know right now I'm like way too selfish to have children. But it took me a while to get to that comfortability, and
I love it,
and there's
though.
still spaces where I'm like, this isn't a safe space for me to advertise that. And I still have times where I'm in like maybe a therapy circle and I'm like, should I bring in this ace identity? Because there are those who just shut it down.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So, and who still say, oh, there must be something wrong with it. Because we live in such a sex normative society, the idea of not engaging, not being sexually attracted, not being in these relationships, not hooking up, all this is so like
something has to be
mind blowing.
wrong.
Yeah, something has to be wrong. And no, there's just some people that's okay. And because what can happen is those under the ace identity feel pressure to engage in sex and they don't want to. And it falls into this thing, and that can be traumatic in of itself. That because this goes with intimacy, again, deconstructing intimacy and love. Like, if I love this person, then I should want to have sex with them. And so there's this, before they maybe know the term, they may engage in a sexual relationship when they don't feel like it's not comfortable to them. And that can cause trauma within the relationship and with them individually as well. And again, when people think intimacy, they go straight to sex. And we know that intimacy is so much more than that. And that, again, I think we're seeing too, I like seeing these articles that let's like normalize having really strong, close friendships. Like, why is that like off the table? Why, because that's again with that therapist, like, oh, you'll never know intimately, like, how can you help relationships? I'm like, well, I have experienced heartbreak and pain and loss and things like that.
Yeah.
And I can empathize with people it took a while, because sometimes I go to like, oh, there's so much other thing, like, the get over it mentality. But now doing my work and really growing up and being older, I'm like, yeah, I can empathize that how important that person was to you and how painful that loss is. And I can be ace and do that. Nothing says I can't be. Like, we're not aliens. We're not on a different level. Like, we are human and we understand pain and heartbreak and loss and grief. Maybe not in the same way, but we do experience it.
Yep. Exactly. And this is something that I'm always pushing on people too, from a relationship anarchy space. Have you heard of this?
Mm-hmm. I have. I don't know much, but I have heard about and reading about it.
Yeah. Well, that's what I'm doing my dissertation on. So this is where I come in, right? Like, and it's this concept that we're always in relationship with people, right?
Mm-hmm.
We, in this Western heteronormative lens, we've just been so like the best and most intimate relationship you could have is your sexual relationship with your partner for the rest of your life and all of that, versus how can we come back to recognize that we're constantly in relationship with a ton of different people and can have intimacy that takes on various forms with a ton of different people. And so I'm always pushing people, I'm like, I'm intimate with my friends. And they're like, well, not in the way that you are with your sexual lovers. And I'm like, what? Like, what? Where do you draw this line? Where do you say one
Mm-hmm.
is this and one is that? Like, because I think once you start to look at it, there is
Yeah.
no defining lines for these things. Like, you
No.
can have intimacy of all shapes, kinds, forms, and it's so co-created with the person
Mm-hmm.
before you.
Yeah, and again, history nerd, right? Like, we can historically look at how this Western idea of marriage and things kind of come, and it goes back to like reproduction. It goes back to reproduction.
Tell me the whole
Yeah.
story. I'm here.
And, you know, we have, first of all, the Victorian era was huge because that became the whole purity thing,
Mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm.
So, you know, being pure, and again, it's reproduction. It was all about reproduction then, and it created this, okay, like this goal of being married and having children, you know, and then it go to, again, we can look at, and people probably say this, land owning, things like that. And, but it was more, yeah, it was more the Victorian era that really, really brought in the idea of being this pure kind of woman. Of course, it existed before then, but it getting really popularized, I guess, was more in that Victorian kind of era. That's when the romance books kind of started.
Yeah, romanticism
Well,
of the 17th century.
romanticism,
Yeah,
right?
17th century
We
coming
got
in.
love stories and stuff like
Yes.
that, right? You know
Yes.
English, so you know, like, the literature started changing
Mm-hmm.
into
Art,
from,
yeah.
you know, we got like the Pride and Prejudice and all that kind, and it the whole, you know, that really shifted the idea of this kind of romantic relationship. So we had this purity, but we also had romance. And Bridgerton, right? This idea of falling in love, that was really in that Victorian era piece.
Which is
But
also
before-
hilarious.
Which
Yeah,
is hilarious, because before then it was like it was a business
yes.
contract. It was a
Yes.
business contract. Romance is not part of the picture. Like chivalry, if you study our theory literature, you know what chivalry is. Not good. It was not like, I'm going to bring roses and open doors. It's like, no, I'm going to kidnap you. Like,
Exactly.
It was, yeah. So it shifted. So now we have this idea of romance and the romantic relationship, right? And then, okay, now sex and to be in love, you must have sex. And, you know, because you get married and you have babies, that's what you're supposed to do. And now as you're going with this anarchy, it's like, well, where did these rules come from?
Yes.
Right?
Who said this?
Who said
that this is the best way to do this relationship, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, yeah, we stopped having kids once we started no longer needing them to
Mm-hmm.
survive through whatever, you know, farming conditions we were in as we became a more industrialized society. We didn't need workers on our little land plots,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and I'm sure there was love and caring throughout some of these situations, but it's so fascinating to me that people in this current day forget that just very recently, women were property.
Mm-hmm.
Very recently, within the last 100 years,
Yeah.
women were property.
Yeah, I had professors telling me, and you know, they're not that old, like from the 70s, having to get permission to open a credit card. Like that
Exactly, that is exactly what I was going to say. A credit card. You couldn't get a credit card until
Yeah.
1960.
Yeah, and so now we have basically a bunch of people recognize, like, oh, I don't have to be in a relationship to feel fulfilled. And that's the big piece. And that's what I'm hoping to bring into the narrative of, because that's been so into the development of human psychology, was the milestone. Okay, like you're a teen and you have this sexual awakening, and then you discover yourself, and then you kind of settle down, and then you have the marriage and the babies and the kids. And now people are like, well, what if that's not part of my development? What if that's not my narrative? How, like, I can be fulfilled and never be engaged with another person. And again, it's not, I think when people, the acephobic get scared and say, like, well, you're saying, like, there'll never be romance. I'm like, no, I love looking at my friends' wedding pictures and stuff like that. It's just, now we need to just open space and add this to the narrative, because, well, some of my friends are getting married and having these, you know, and that's the norm. And I'm over here and I'm going to do wedding pictures with my dissertation once it's done. So, like,
Yeah.
you know, like,
I love that. That's a good idea. I should do that too.
That's my committed relationship right now. Yeah, again, it's that whole marriage. That should be the goal, especially as a woman. Like, that should be the goal. And then it's like, that's not my goal. That's not even close to my goal. And as I look back, I'm like, part of me is like, maybe one day I'll just buy a wedding dress because they're so pretty and I want to wear one. But I'm like, I don't want the actual wedding part though.
Yeah, I've seen someone who married themselves and had a whole ceremony and like walked down the aisle and did it. And you know, it's so frustrating to okay, well, I'm excited. One, because I think like when we look at the history of women not being able to own a credit card to where we're at now, that gives me so much hope because we're finally for the first time realizing that us as women can survive in this world, and not just survive but thrive in this world without a relationship, you know, a significant sort of partner, where in years past you literally could not. That was not an option. You couldn't have a credit card, you couldn't get a job, you couldn't do this stuff. And so how is this going to change in the next 100 years, the amount of people that get married in general? Just because, I mean, some people will still want that, but just having the option of it not being forced, I think will change people.
Yeah. And I mean, we still live kind of in a world where there's this idea like you need that partner, right? Like, okay, who's going to be in charge? Like if something were to happen, the medical stuff. And
Sure.
I'm from California, right? So we need someone to help with rent. And I think I'm like, yeah, but look at the Golden Girl option, right? The Golden Girls option. This again highlighting the importance of these friendships or these communities of you can share a home with someone you care about, but you don't have to be in love with them or be in like that relationship with them. So like normalizing that as well, like having these important people in your life that can exist outside of these, like the marriage or the relationship or the romantic partner, right? Like, and this is someone who I trust to handle these things too. And I think that's where we're going to start leaning to as more and more people are like, yeah, I don't need to be in this romantic relationship to survive. Like I can survive on my own. I want to have these friendships, like these partners, I guess you'll say that. So because as you know, we like humans like connection. The pandemic threw that in our face. All those introverts, including me, like we don't need people. Haha. Yes, we do.
Yes, we do.
But we don't always need romantic people. But those who do, like they need it too. Again, because I have friends where the romance, like my brother and his girlfriend, for instance, they love romance and they love being, and I'm like, yeah, I'm not going to take that away. It's cute. I'm like their number one fan. But I think a lot of people who come with this acephobic idea are thinking we're trying to erase that. Right. And of course there's asexual people who are not aromantic, who have romantic attraction, who do want all the romance, just not the pressure to always engage in the sexual piece of it. Because their sexual orientation is different. That's again recognizing the difference between a romantic orientation and a sexual orientation. So I think it's just we're changing the narrative. We're bringing in more. It's not so much even really changing. I love Pride and Prejudice too, right? Love it. But what would it be like if is it Emily Bent? No, I'm Emily. I'm forgetting her name. But Jane? What would Jane? No, that's her sister.
Maybe?
That's her sister. What would it have been like if she was like Elizabeth? I think it was Elizabeth. What would it have been like if she was like, nope. I know back then that couldn't have happened, but
that's
no.
Did you read Little Women?
I did not read Little Women.
Okay, so Little Women, this is actually my like undergrad thesis was on Little Women about Jo. So she is like the one character that never got married. And I remember Louisa May Alcott, I read her journals and she was talking about how so many of her publishers were trying to get her to marry that character. And she was like, no, she does not need to get married. And, having that sort of first character that does do that sort of space where she's like, no, I'm happy with what I'm doing. And I think what frustrates me so much is that men have been doing this for years. There have been so many men that have pursued their intellectual careers and have studied science and done all this stuff and never gotten these deep romantic relationships and been so fulfilled through their studies and all that they're doing in the other aspects of their lives. And none of us bat an eye to say, oh, like that man's not living their life. But the second that a woman wants to do it, it's like,
yeah, and to open space, because of course I've been talking because I am a woman, but to be an asexual man is a whole other thing.
Significantly harder.
yeah, because men are hypersexualized in this society. So what is it like? I don't know. I'm a woman. So I was,
Oof.
of course, in this interview talking through my experience. And I hope to, first is just get the dissertation done and expand and looking at, okay, what's like the ace man's lived experience, which is a whole other where, people forget to talk that I'm just going to say boys are pressured into having sex. And if they don't, something's wrong with them, right? Sometimes it's okay for women because it's like, oh yeah, you're pure, going to wait till marriage. Like there's this whole, again, that romanticized piece.
Women don't have a sex drive anyways, like all.
Yeah. And
Ugh.
where men are told the exact opposite. And so there's being pressured like to have maybe sex before they're ready, both as an allosexual and an asexual. So what is it like to be an asexual man? And that's, of course, and I'm seeing this too, including myself, that a lot of people who are writing these ace stories, like they are mostly women, right? So again, who's missing? I always look for who's missing in the narrative.
Which I love that you're doing that. Yes.
And I saw it here, but I think, I can't remember your name, but you're talking about, that asexuality has been kind of known as like it's white, like the white person. So where the asexual Black person of color and that narrative, right? And I'm, of course, I'm Mexican Italian, but again, I'm white presenting, so I am speaking to that. So I'm like, where are the missing narratives?
Yes, that needs space.
Yeah, because of the own narrative of a certain culture and how they view sex, or how the projection of the dominant culture perceives that culture and sex, right? And so what is like to grow up in there as an asexual person? So it's a whole, I think we're just at the tip of the iceberg when it comes to asexuality and the study of asexuality. Of course, it's been like happening. There's a lot of wonderful research kind of out there that in the last decade and maybe a little bit before, but now that we're seeing more and more youth identifying with this, and I'm seeing a lot of ace boys kind of identifying with this. I'm like, okay, let's do it. Right? Let's add this narrative now. Let's start talking about it. And I think it's really important as mental health practitioners to learn about this identity.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about how you were saying allosexual people are so worried that asexuality is just going to destroy the concept of sexuality for them. And that same fear really happened, I feel like, when the LGBTQ movement started coming up, that, oh, what does this mean? That I can't have my heterosexual relationship? And it's like, no, it actually says nothing about you. We are just creating more space for the diversity. You can still do what you want to do. Yeah,
when gay marriage started, we're still seeing it, where people don't want to bring in LGBTQ studies, queer studies into public, like high schools and things like that. And it's like, well, they don't need to know. I'm like, yeah, but there's likely one queer person in your classroom.
Who needs to know?
Who needs to know the history of, this. And it really amplifies, I think, people of colors, because we know Black people of color were really big in queer history, like in all that stuff. So, and transgender brings in the transgender. So it's like, most people exist in your classroom. They're probably not, in some classrooms, not going to show it, like me, because we don't know what we're going to get, but they're there. So again, it's, like I said, me finding that term on the internet was just everything that I always thought was wrong with me was now validated that I'm okay. And having that, and when you have that experience, you recognize the importance of it and why it's really needed.
Yes, what a powerful journey to have been, through that personally now, and to be dedicating your studies to creating, more space, more understanding for these sorts of things. It's so fascinating to me and disheartening, I guess, that people get so uncomfortable about the idea of holding more space for diversity. That's all we're trying to do, is just say that there's different people out there that have different desires than you. Why does that scare so many people?
That, again, Jungian psyche person here. Like, we know, like, people fear unknown. Our ego likes normality. It likes comfort. And every time we like boxes, it's like we like structure. Well, especially Western society, we've been trained to like structure. And when we go out of that box, especially for the age who weren't fitting in a box, and for those who don't fit in a box, like, oh, you're changing the rules. and there's comfort in the rules. So now when we change them, so people will fight back on that. And
Ugh.
yeah, and part of it is, yes, there's some people where I'm like, forget you. And then there's some, okay, how can I approach this with empathy? It's part of being a teacher, I think. And that's one of the reasons why I say, like, I put myself out there. So for those who do want to engage in conversation in a respectful way, I will be glad to do
Yes.
it. I'm not going to be here for like
Yes.
there's something wrong, that kind of mentality. But for those who are like, I want to ask questions, but are scared to ask questions, like I said, I will maintain my boundaries, but I'm totally open to answering questions that you have. That's part of the work too. And then I always tell people, I tell my students too, you want to know about someone's lived experience, read memoirs, read books. So like, don't just read the textbook, read the
Yeah.
memoirs and the biographies and the autobiographies of people who, you know, their experience. And mostly memoir. I like memoirs. That's my jam. But I'm like, that's how you can do it, right? Or you go listen to these podcasts, these interviews, right? Watch shows created by creators from that community. And that's a pretty easy place to start, I
Yeah.
think. Yeah.
Do you think you'll want to make a memoir eventually?
People have been telling me when they've heard my dissertation, like, you should turn this into a book. So I think maybe one day, I don't know, my adventures as an ACE therapist, but yeah, people have been telling me that. So I'm thinking about maybe doing something like that as well. I think, and then I get this thought, well, because a lot of memoirs have the big sexual journey piece, and I'm like, people are like, well, they'll find it boring because you don't have that. I'm like, well, that's what I'll be talking about, right? What it was like not to have that huge kind of,
Exactly.
yeah.
And what you do know is that there
Mhm.
are other people who have had a similar lived experience to you
Yeah.
who would benefit greatly from being able to hear your inner thoughts.
Yeah, and again, I had a breakdown on college campus. Like, who has not had a breakdown on college campus at some point in their lives? And I'm like, that's what I can share, right? That's what I can share. And that had nothing to do with, that was just being the college student, being a first generation college student and trying to navigate that, right? Yeah. And that, you know, not knowing your place in the world and thinking the plan disrupt. That's like how like I said, I'm somehow a therapist, and people know me as the person who's not a fan of people. And that's how they knew me. And here I am in a profession that's all about people, and I love it.
Caring, love,
Yeah.
and intimacy. Let's
And
be very clear.
intimacy.
Like, you have intimacy with your clients.
You do, yeah. It's a weird one because I know a lot about them and they don't know that much about me. And you know, like, and sometimes I am a fan of self-disclosing for therapeutic reasoning.
Sure. Yeah.
Right? But, you know, like, there's that level of, like, I'm trusting you with everything that sometimes the romantic partners don't even, or sex partners don't even know about them. And
exactly.
a lot of times that intimacy, it's hard to describe. I mean, I think those who've been to therapy or therapists, they're different. Like, I have being a client and then being a therapist and holding those spaces are very intimate places to be in.
Of course, yeah, because I mean, I have a therapist and I've dumped my whole heart and thought and, you know, the things that maybe I only say to myself to that person. It's an intimate relationship. We don't engage in any sexual activity, obviously, and there's a ton of boundaries between our professional relationship, but that does not mean that it's not intimate. I also have intimacy with my mom, you know what I mean? Like, we're so like, oh, exactly what you said earlier, intimacy means sex. It's like, no, it doesn't always.
No,
it can if you would like it to, but I have an intimate relationship with my mother, and that's healthy and beautiful that we're close and able to have that, you know? People get so tabooed and like feel, and we really got to expand. What does it mean to be in relationship with people? What does it mean to have intimate relationships? And how do we, take off the lenses that have been trying to put us in boxes that are truly not serving the diversity of the human experience?
Yeah. I'm thinking things are changing. I'm seeing it the more we talk about this podcasts like this, right?
Sure.
And again, taking away the taboo of the word intimate. And as we know, there's so many different forms of intimacy. There's so much different, even outside of like touch. There's intimate touch that does not mean sex as well.
Yes.
Right. And again, I bring that in not just for my ACE clients, but those who have experienced like sexual trauma, right? And are relearning their body, and there's a lot of body trauma, I think, within the ACE community and with people in general. I think that, there's a lot of body trauma. That's what I mostly work with as well. But like, again, intimacy and these intimate touches don't always mean sex. So what does that mean? And it's the whole, I'm excited to see it. And I love that me talking, like, I'm getting engagement from these people. Like, again, oh, now I'm thinking about, like, that's all I want you to do is just to think about it. Right? I'm not even saying you have to be like, woohoo, go Ace. Like, I just want you to think about it. Expand.
Openness.
Open.
That's all we want, right?
That's all we want. Yeah.
Yes.
And yeah, we can go on, regarding like asexual and polyamory and polyamorous relationships, and which, you had Jolie talk about that probably, obviously, and then what does that mean? And I see a few of those who are in poly relationships, so, opening and expanding that doesn't mean there's an attachment issue, because people go in, there must be some attachment, they can't be intimate. I'm like, so again, that it's deconstruction, when we can deconstruct some of these words and open them and make so much space for all these other beautiful form of relationships that exist outside of that, the norm.
Yep. This is why I've been trying to take out like a step away from this monogamy poly-binary, right? Like I am in relationship with a ton of different people all the time that have varying degrees of intimacy, varying degrees of boundaries and commitments, right? Like that's ultimately what's happening regardless of what I'm doing, and having that space to create that allows for like, if I am in a deep relationship with someone who's asexual, how can we create intimacy between the two of us,
Yeah. And because a lot of ace people enter relationships with allosexual people as well. So what does that mean to be in a relationship with somebody who's ace, to the compromises, the dialogue, the communication, right? I'm always bringing in the proper BDSM community, because I'm like, like you got to do that. You got to have those conversations. And especially if you're ace and allo and in a relationship, to have a healthy relationship, you got to know boundaries. You got to discuss what touch is okay. And again, I think people like, well, if they're ace, they're never going to want to have sex. That's not true for all asexual people. There are sex positive and there's demisexual. And, if it's like, I do care about you and I will but it's not going to be like maybe a nightly thing or an every week. They could be really rare. So then it's like, well, let's talk about polyamory then, and polyamorous poly relationships, and maybe that can be put on the table, right? And then how can we engage with that? So again, it's opening that space, and it's like, well, if I have sex with this, but does that mean I don't love them? No.
Yeah.
Not at all.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
I guess it's just changing the narrative, opening space.
Yes. Opening the space to create it yourselves with those, two or more people, whatever allows the two of you to feel intimate, or the three, whatever amount of numbers we have here. It's all about these relationships and how do both parties feel safe, loved, intimate, and let's just create abundance of space to do that. Nothing is stopping us. These are all societal pressures that are saying this is how you do it, this is how you do it, and we don't have to listen to them if we don't want to. We can create them. And I'm going to bring it all the way back to the mythology piece. Do it. We've already seen this in a lot of mythological stories. Because it's part of the human experience. And then that's why us Jungians like to bring in myth, because it's already existed. Yep, in the human psyche.
In the human psyche, the collective unconscious. Of course, there's little, when it got put through like a patriarchal lens, we're going to lose bits and pieces. But if we go into, well, how can we look at this archetypal mythological image as an autonomous being? And that's where active imagination, all that fun stuff comes in. Like, what would they say about these relationships that are new to us, but aren't actually really new to the human experience at all. And, and that's where these myths and stories come in, right? So it's engaging both the current lived experience and these experiences of the past.
Yes, and I love that you're doing that work with your history background to kind of, enlighten people that this has been around for a long time, and let's start talking about these narratives that maybe weren't present before. And I love that you are continually asking who's missing from this story and how can we bring those stories forward too. I think that's such an important piece in terms of looking forward and how can we make this an even better future, is continually asking that question of whose narrative is missing.
Yeah. And I'm I'm looking and then I ask, am I the right one to tell this story, or can I make space for somebody else to tell this story? As in my dissertation, it's following the work of Dr. Christine Downing, who, if you're a Pacific person, you know who she is, if you're listening, who's great. I love her. And Jane Bolen Shinoda. And then I'm bringing this, and who's to say, like, a few years or maybe someone 2 years down the road could say, okay, now I'm going to add this to the narrative. Right. So I'm just recognizing when it's okay for me to tell certain stories, and some stories are not meant for me to tell. And so knowing that case, but can I make space for someone to add that? As in me bringing in asexuality into the depth psychological field is just, again, the tip of the iceberg. It's just kind of, I don't even really want to say step one. It's like a little bit smaller than that. And now that that's there, because when I was looking at dissertations and saying, oh, you don't want to like do the same thing, I'm like, oh, yeah, it's not even there. I got 0 search results.
That's what I got for relationship anarchy. Yeah, it's like nothing. You're like, okay.
Now there will be at least one, and then it's
at least one,
right? So that's again, and now that could be like, well, if there's at least one, maybe I can add to it.
Yes, exactly. Beginning that whole journey of filling in these large gaps in the psychological field, which is so, so exciting. Yeah, I'm excited to see all the work that you're going to do in the next, years of learning and getting deeper into this.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the questions I do ask everyone on the podcast as my closing question is, what is one thing that you wish other people knew was more normal?
That not having sex is normal. I was going to say it.
Say it.
Not having a crush, not having sex, and not falling in love are normal.
And there's so many people that just hearing that would feel accepted and feel able to be present in their authentic self just from hearing you say that.
Thank you.
Yeah. It was such a pleasure to have you on. Do you have anywhere that if people are really connecting with you, I know you mentioned that you're open to people reaching out to you and asking questions. Is there anywhere that you'd recommend them to get in contact?
My Instagram page is probably the best.
Okay.
So that would be, it's like, should I say it out loud, or are you going to?
Sure, whatever you want to do. I'll hyperlink it below, so people can have it.
That would be the best, because it has the link to like my website and how to contact me there. But, and it's at _therapy_witch.com or not .com, that's also therapywitch.com is my website. Sorry, at _therapy_witch. And because we didn't even get into that, I'm also like that identity and that history and all that fun stuff. And I will say, because I'm so busy, I'm not up to date with like doing content stuff, but feel free, I do check it. So if anyone wants to reach out regarding ACE, mental health, Jungian psychology, they can feel free to contact me on there as well.
Yeah. Yes. I love that you're putting out that space. If people need you and need to connect with you, you're here. It's very kind. Yeah. Well, it's so good to hear from your lived experience. I think exactly what you're talking about of some stories are not meant to be told from certain people. And this is not my story to tell. This is your story to tell. And it's been such a pleasure to hold space and to share your story, and with listeners and hopefully help expand just our ideas and our consciousness to make a better, more loving world.
And thank you for creating this space. And, I was listening to some of your, other guests. I'm like, holy shit, like these are awesome, right? These are awesome people on here. So yeah, thank you for creating this space.
If you enjoyed today's episode, then leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcast. And if you're a part of the anarchist community, then follow us on Instagram or nominate a guest for the show by sending in a letter to modernanarchypodcast@gmail.com. Otherwise, I'll see you next week.